Maybe it's taken him by surprise. It's certainly taken the Democratic Party establishment by surprise. No one expected he'd be where he is today. He has tens of thousands of people in some instances coming to his campaign rallies, millions of small donors. He's ahead in the popular vote, although far behind in delegates, probably because of superdelegates. He says that students should go to school and it should be free, that student debt should be lifted, that affordable health care should be a right. And he also calls for a political revolution. What do you think about that? I mean, that's something quite new in the American electoral scene. What is a political revolution? What is the significance of Sanders' campaign? What are your thoughts?
The only thing that I think should be qualified is the phrase political revolution. What he's actually calling for is what was pretty well understood and accepted in the 1950s. In fact, President Eisenhower wouldn't have been much surprised by his proposals. He's fundamentally, as I read his positions, a New Deal Democrat, traditional New Deal Democrat, in the fact that it's his and his positions have been supported by a considerable part of the population, often large majorities, for decades. So he's putting forth positions which are very familiar among people's attitudes, in fact, often strongly supported. Take, say, national health care. Right now, about 60% of the population support it, which is pretty remarkable when you think that nobody publicly advocates it. Every time it's brought up, it's denounced. But still, considerable majority supports it. You go back a little further, say to Reagan years, about 80% of the population thought it ought to be guaranteed by the Constitution. In fact, about 40% thought it was guaranteed by the Constitution. These are long, and the same as, take, say, free education. That's what it was like in the 1950s, virtually. The GI Bill gave not only free education, but even subsidies to huge numbers of people, veterans, who would never have gone to college. It was very good for them, very good for the country. It's part of the reason for the very high and relatively equitable growth rate in the 50s and the 60s before the neoliberal reaction set in. It's common in other countries, rich countries like Germany, poor countries like Mexico. These are hardly surprising positions, but in the fact that they're regarded as extremist or that it calls for a revolution is actually a comment on how the spectrum within the mainstream has shifted to the right during the neoliberal years.
Indeed, we have at one time you couldn't call yourself a communist during the witch hunt, then you couldn't call yourself a socialist. Then in the 1980s and 90s after Reagan, the L word, the liberal word, also was banished. All of the progressive words associated with social change or social justice or even traditional Democratic Party mainstream programs were exorcised from the political lexicon. So now you have somebody calling himself a democratic socialist, which was one of those banned terms, saying, okay, we should have these programs which are essentially liberal programs. But the entire Democratic Party establishment and, of course, Wall Street seem completely alarmed. I mean, does it take a political revolution to get back to even mainstream politics?
No, I don't think it takes a political revolution. I think it takes a return to a situation which was far from radical. So, for example, just to illustrate, back in the 1950s, a common quip about the political system, not inaccurate, was that the United States is a one-party state, the business party, which has two factions called Democrats and Republicans, which differ somewhat. If you take the situation today, it's still a one-party state, the business party, but it only has one faction. And it's not Democrats, it's moderate Republicans who call themselves Democrats. If you take a look at today's Democratic Party, it's pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. Meanwhile, the Republicans have simply drifted off the political spectrum. They're not a political party in any recognizable form.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because you have Donald Trump. I mean, it's amazing, actually. Donald Trump He commanding lead in South Carolina. He won in New Hampshire. He may, to the surprise of all conventional wisdom and the pundits and certainly the Republican establishment, he could actually take the nomination. Now, you have Trump calling for building a wall at the U.S.-Mexican border. He says, like the Israeli apartheid wall. He says, ban Muslims, deport 11 million immigrants. Yesterday or a few days ago, he said the protesters at his rally should be taken out on a stretcher like the good old days. I mean, do you see in Trump, of course there's a deep strain of white supremacy in America, but do you see with the Trump campaign and the surprising results the danger of some sort of neo-fascist or fascist kind of movement, or is it something else?
Well, first of all, when you speak about the Republican Party, I'm actually speaking about the Republican establishment being off the spectrum, not Trump. That's an interesting phenomenon, but a different one. So take somebody like Mitch McConnell, who's considered a Republican moderate. What was his reaction to Obama's election? It was very clear. He said, we have to have one policy, no. Anything that the government proposes, we say no, and we block it, because we want to take power. That's not parliamentary politics. And in fact, this is recognized. Some of the most respected conservative political analysts, Norman Ornstein, Thomas Mann of the American Enterprise Institute, right-wing think tank, they simply described, not Trump, they're talking about the mainstream, they described today's Republican Party as, in their words, a radical insurgency which has abandoned parliamentary politics. And I think the reason is pretty clear. As both in the United States and in Europe, and in fact everywhere where neoliberal programs have been imposed, there's an undermining of democracy. That's one of their aspects. Could go into it, but it's almost automatic, and you can see it happening. One consequence of that is that the sort of mainstream center begins to collapse, and you get uprisings at both what are called both extremes. One of them is a far-right extreme. The other is called left. It's actually kind of center-left, social democratic, like Sanders or Corbyn and so on. Nothing particularly radical about it. As the parties have shifted to the right, the Republicans became so dedicated to the interests of extreme wealth and power that they simply cannot get votes on their own programs. And they therefore had to mobilize sectors of the population that have always been there but hadn't been mobilized as a political force. So a substantial plurality, maybe even majority of Republicans are evangelical Christians, extremist, fundamentalist Christians, people who think the world was created a couple of thousand years ago.
Can you see a Donald Trump presidency?
Can I see it? I think it would be, if he means what he says, not just the things you mentioned, but much more serious ones, it's virtually a death knell for the species. Every Republican candidate in the primaries, and Trump specifically, deny that global warming is taking place, or at least that we should do anything about it.
And Michelle Bachmann said she was the one who admitted it in 2012, and she said it was God's punishment for homosexuality or something like that.
I mean, she's far off the spectrum, but I'm talking about the mainstream. All of them say either it's not happening or we shouldn't do anything about it. And they're acting to try to undermine anything that might deal with it even moderately. So, for example, take the Paris meetings last December. They weren't marvelous, but they achieved at least something minimal. They were hoping to achieve a treaty with commitments that would be fixed and verifiable.
For emissions.
But they couldn't, and it was very clear why they couldn't. In fact, it was recognized in the mainstream press. Republican Congress wouldn't permit it. They will not permit a verifiable a treaty. So what you have to have is voluntary agreements. The Supreme Court just a couple of weeks ago, the right-wing justices, at that time there were 5, now 4 with Scalia's death, they violated long-standing precedent, went out of their way to effectively block efforts to reduce emissions from coal plants. They gave arguments, but the fundamental reason is just the unwillingness of today's Republican organization, I hesitate to call them a party even, to address this question. This is critical for the survival of the species. Support for torture is bad enough. The idea of getting Mexico to build a wall is grotesque. But this is lethal. And why is it happening? Well, I think we have to ask, where is the support for Trump coming from? If there isn't careful data, but it seems to be substantially lower middle class, relatively uneducated, white males mostly. These are the same sectors of the population that are suffering something unprecedented in modern history, increase in mortality. That's an astonishing fact. The latest Nobel laureate in economics got his prize for recognizing it, but it's much more widespread. These are sectors of the population who see no hope. Their lives have been, the neoliberal programs have led, as elsewhere, to pretty much stagnation, for even decline for large parts of the population, alongside of accumulation of spectacular wealth in a tiny sector which has become a kind of a different society. They're separated from the mainstream society. The hope for the future has declined for the first time, maybe in history. I'm old enough to remember the Depression, which was objectively much worse than today, but it was a hopeful period. My relatives, unemployed factory workers and so on, lived at a level of poverty much beyond anything today, but they expected that the future would be better. Things were happening. CIO organizing was taking place. It was a relatively sympathetic administration. Moderate social democratic programs were being instituted. It looked as if somehow we'll get out of this. That's not the attitude today. The people who are coming to the Trump rallies, as far as you can tell, are people to a large extent who feel that everything's been taken away from them. And there is, as you mentioned, a strong element of white supremacy. One demographic fact is that the white population pretty soon, in the foreseeable future, will actually be a minority. So they are taking our country away from us. There's always been, way back, a bitter anti-immigrant extremism. The first, apart from Oriental exclusion, the first major immigration bill in 1924, after the First World War, was pretty much aimed at Italians and Jews. They called it Eastern, Southern, and South, Eastern European and South European, but that meant Jews and Italians. That's one of the reasons why plenty of Jews ended up in gas chambers. They couldn't get here. And that went right through to, after the end of the war. If you go back earlier, right here in Boston, when the Irish immigration came in the late 19th century, you could see signs on restaurants saying, "No dogs are Irish." Irish were treated like African Americans, which is the absolute bottom. And this goes way back. We're here, we don't want you, And Europe, it's even worse. I think Europe is probably more racist than the United States. You can see it right now. But this is real, and this is part of the cheering for Trump when he says build a wall. And if you think about it, what is that wall supposed to do? In fact, what is Obama doing? Obama has been pressuring Mexico to keep the Central Americans away from our border. Why are people fleeing Central America? Because the U.S. destroyed Central America, especially under the Reagan years.
If we could, in the limited time we have, I want to move over to the Obama administration and also to Hillary Clinton, who was, of course, the Secretary of State during the first Clinton term. On October 20th, the day Gaddafi was killed, he was lynched after a very long bombing campaign. Thousands of bombs and missiles dropped on Libya in the name of protecting civilians. Finally, it ended after he was killed, but that day Hillary Clinton was caught on video saying, "We came, we saw, he died," kind of happy, giddy. I mean, here we have ISIL, Islamic State, so-called, now taking over big parts of Libya, as they have in Iraq, as they have in Syria. And you have the Obama administration largely responsible, at least in the last 7 years, for policies, I believe, that have created the space for ISIL. Of course, the Bush invasion in 2003 of Iraq got the ball rolling. But Clinton and the Obama administration, they came in not as Republicans, not as George W. Bush. Everyone was so excited. I was on the inaugural parade route. Millions of people. There was like euphoria. People felt not only is Bush leaving, but the Bush era is ending. Something new is happening, something positive.
Well, one qualification. It's not true that everybody was excited.
I meant everyone who was cheering.
I wasn't. In fact,
I wasn't either.
I wrote about it even before the primaries and tried hard to warn people not to put faith in Obama. There's nice rhetoric, but if you look at the policies that he was advocating, they were pretty ugly.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. It seems, as you described, the political establishment has moved so far to the right that even basic liberal programs have now been considered a threat to the economic and political elites and exercised and called communist or socialist. When Obama introduced Obamacare, which was Mitt Romney's program, they called that socialist and communist. But has U.S. foreign policy been basically taken over by the neoconservative framework?
No, it's been taken over by mainstream liberalism, which is very hawkish. Take Obama's position on the war in Iraq, which he's praised highly for opposing the war. Ask yourself why he opposed it. He says, we don't have to invent it. He says he opposed it because it was a strategic blunder, not because it's wrong to invade another country and not only violate international law radically, but smash up the country, destroy it, kill hundreds of thousands of people, generate millions of refugees, ignite a sectarian conflict which did not exist before, which is now tearing the country and the region apart. That's not the reason to object to it, rather because it was a blunder. It was going to cost us too much. I mean, that's like Russian generals who opposed the invasion of Afghanistan, said, look, this is pretty stupid. We shouldn't do it. Do we praise them? I don't. But he's the most extreme protest, objection that can be voiced within the mainstream is it was a mistake. It was incidentally exactly the same in the case of Vietnam. It's the worst crime since the post-war era was the invasion of South Vietnam, then all of Indochina. But if you go to the end of the war, when there was strong opposition, popular opposition, I actually reviewed the mainstream commentary. You go to the far critical extreme, say Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. He says the U.S. began with blundering efforts to do good. Now that's a tautology. Anything we do is an effort to do good. So we began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969, it was clear that it was a disaster, and we could not achieve our benign goals at a cost acceptable to ourselves. So it was really a mistake. That's the answer to the question of invading a country, killing millions of people, destroying the region, chemical warfare, which is people still dying in Saigon hospitals. The only thing is it was a mistake. It cost us too much.
In Syria, in August, September 2013, I remember very vividly because I was outside the White House protesting against the possible and what seemed to be inevitable war against Syria, the bombing war, not the other war. But at that time, John Kerry, who was demanding the bombing and who said Syria has crossed the red line, and that red line was established by Obama because the Syrians purportedly used chemical weapons, at that time there was no comment at all about ISIL. It was all against the Syrian Arab Army, the Syrian government. Whatever one thinks about the Assad government, it was the secular, nationalist, independent government. It had opposed groups like ISIL in the past. Whatever one characterizes it. Today the U.S. government has completely shifted in one way, maybe not completely, has shifted in one way, both its rhetoric and its orientation, and has agreed with Russia that there should be a ceasefire in Syria. From your point of view, what accounts for this kind of change? Obviously, there was grassroots opposition to a new war in 2013, but this is a pretty profound shift, isn't it?
Well, first of all, I think we should recognize that the Assad government is absolutely monstrous. It's a vicious, brutal government which has carried out enormous atrocities. It was harsh and autocratic before, but in the course of the past few years, it's guilty of extraordinary war crimes. What accounts for the U.S. policy, and in fact, most policy, is pretty incoherent. But what accounts for the change is just the change in the situation on the ground. At that point, there was no ISIS in Syria. Now there is.
In 2013, there was.
Barely. Now it's a very substantial force. And the question is exactly what to do to try to find. The U.S. it wasn't so much opposed to a ceasefire. It was calling for negotiations, but at first on the condition that the Assad government not participate. It did shift position on that. The Assad government, as I said, is monstrous, but it has to participate in negotiations. To reject that is just a call for endless war, because they're not going to just say goodbye, please kill me. So yes, they have to participate. And that was a move which was proper, I think. The one slim hope, and it's pretty slim, for something happening in Syria short of self-destruction of the country is ceasefires, a negotiated settlement with eventual diplomatic outcome, which will probably be pretty ugly. That's, if there's any other hope, I don't see it. But if you look at what's actually happening, it's pretty incoherent. I mean, Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And they're have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, other U.S. allies, are openly supporting the al-Nusra Front, as is Turkey publicly, which is hardly different from ISIS. The U.S. is supporting the Syrian Kurds, but opposing the Iraqi, the related Kurdish group in Turkey, in Iraq, which is in fact on the terrorist list. The policies, I mean, you have to kind of sympathize with the Obama administration. It's very hard to imagine a coherent policy in this complex. And it does trace back to the, you were correct, it traces back to the invasion of Iraq, which, among its other crimes, did instigate the sectarian conflict and the atrocities, out of which finally came this particular monstrosity, ISIS. And if it is simply destroyed, as it could be by force, without dealing with the roots of it, something even worse will probably come up. You cannot just say, okay, I don't like this guy, let's kill him, without asking what happens next. Every serious analyst has pointed out, William Polk, Andrew Coburn, just about everyone, that if you kill some terrorist leader or destroy some terrorist group, without looking at the roots of where they came from, you're going to get someone worse. It's happened consistently over the years. Just recently, one of the main U.S. government what they call terrorist specialists, Bruce Hoffman, warned that if the current policies of aiming to kill the leader of ISIS, if they succeed, he says we can be pretty confident that somebody younger, more militant, more violent, more extremist is going to replace him. That's been the consistent pattern. So you must deal with the roots of the phenomenon, not just say, okay, let's kill this bad guy. And that has not been done. I mean, take a look at the so-called global war on terror, which was declared in 2001. At that time, what they call terrorists was located in a small, remote tribal area of Afghanistan. Where is it now? All over the world. Every time you hit the system with a sledgehammer, you make it worse. Iraq is one case, Libya is another. At that time, the initiative was not Obama, it was France. It was France, followed by England, and the United States went along. They did ram through a Security Council resolution, which called for a ceasefire and protection civilians, negotiations, diplomacy. Actually, Gaddafi accepted it, but NATO did not. They immediately violated it, became the air force of the rebels. The effect of that was to sharply increase the number of casualties, at least by a factor of 10, according to an analysis by pretty conservative analysts in Foreign Affairs, main establishment journal. Sharply increased the number of casualties, left the country in ruins. It's now total chaos in the hands of warring militias. It did open an opportunity for ISIS to establish itself, and it's also it spread. It initiated a vast flow of arms, including pretty high-tech arms, and jihadis to the Middle East, but even worse to Africa. West Africa is now the locus of the worst terrorism in the world, much of it flowing from the NATO attack on Libya. And it also happened to have opened a funnel for refugees fleeing from countries in Africa where Europe has a record, not a very pretty one, extending what's called the refugee crisis in Europe. A lot of this was just the result of the decision to violate the Security Council resolution, their own resolution, and to use the sledgehammer again. Every time you do it, it gets worse. By now, you'd think somebody would notice. You cannot take vulnerable societies with real grievances and say, let's take care of them by smashing them up. No, you're going to get it, something even worse, almost automatically.
Thank you very much, Professor Noam Chomsky. You've taken your time to sit with us to analyze both the domestic policy of the U.S., the foreign policies. We are out of time. I'd like to ask you another question, but I want to...
Okay, let's try until we get interrupted.
The last question is, because you're here, you've been here for so many decades. I remember 40 years ago as a young anti-war activist, I was reading your works, listening to you talk. When you look back and look forward, do you view yourself as a historical optimist at this point or a historical pessimist, or are those improper labels? In other words, do you have hopefulness about what's coming?
Well, as far as hopefulness is concerned, we have two choices, always. We can say, it's hopeless, I'll give up, therefore I'll contribute to the worst possible outcome. Or we can grasp the hopeful signs that are always there and are very much there here right now. So you opened by talking about the support for Sanders. Yeah, that's hopeful. We can grasp that and maybe we'll help make things a little better. It's not much of a choice.
Thank you very much.